Okay, hello everybody. My name is Quincy Landingham, and I'm one of the technical account managers here at UpGuard. I'm located in Florida on the east coast of the United States, so I work primarily with our customers in the Americas, Europe, and Africa. I'm super excited to welcome you all to our panel on vendor risk assessments using security questionnaires. I'd like to start out by introducing our three panelists. From here in the States, we have Nick Klinstiver, who is a third-party risk analyst for UofL Health, an academic healthcare system that provides a full range of care services to the Louisville, Kentucky community. Joining us from Australia, we have Gillian Mountwinter and Matthew Parrelli. Gillian is the Information Security Officer for Hannover, which is one of the largest reinsurance groups in the world. While Matt is a cybersecurity executive at IAG, where he focuses on continuous security assessments of his organization, as well as their third parties. I'd like to start today first by getting our panelists to discuss a little bit more about their roles at their organization. So Nick, why don't we start with you? Would you mind just telling me a little bit more about what you're doing over at UofL Health?
Sure. I'm a risk analyst. Third party isn't my title, and that's my primary focus, but focus on all sorts of things related to security governance, risk, both internally and externally facing, policies, procedures, processes, all that good stuff.
Love it. I appreciate that, Nick. Gillian, how about the same? Would you mind just telling me a little bit more about your role?
Sure. I'm Information Security Officer across the whole company operations, including third parties, but also clean desk policies, HR, technical, every other aspect of security as well. So found UpGuard very helpful on our third parties front.
Love that. I appreciate you. And Matt, how about yourself? Would you mind telling us more about what you're doing at IAG?
Sure. So I'm an executive manager of cyber defense and testing. And as part of that role, we have both offensive security and defensive security. And we look to do continuous assessments of our control environment. Part of that is clearly working with third parties and making sure that their environments are secure as well.
Perfect. Well, I appreciate y'all giving us a little bit more background of what you're doing in your organizations. And we'll start with some of the questions. So Nick, again, I'll kick off with you. Just tell us a little bit about how UofL Health is managing vendor risk right now.
Sure. Well, I got to be honest, it's primarily on us in IT security. I guess generally there's the standard procurement process. One of the first things we want to run through is that security assessment. Make sure they meet all of our standards, meet their own standards. Most importantly, we've found that that's not always the case. And just make sure to do our due diligence, make sure it's a safe and secure platform for our providers to use.
Love it. So a little bit of everything. And Gillian, same question for you. How are you guys managing vendor risk right now?
We've need to comply with an Australian standard, credential standard, which is CPS 234. So we need to put a lot of diligence over every stage of our vendor processing. So we brought in some repeatable processes around risk assessment. That's where we really start with vendors, assessing them by the sensitivity of the information they hold, their criticality to the company, and the amount of technical exposure that they have. So we have that quantified in a template so we can run every vendor through that process. Also, being a large-ish company, we're quite siloed in terms of the contact point for each vendor. So myself and my assistant will liaise separately with every contact point within Hannover to keep that relationship between the vendor flowing smoothly.
Awesome. And Matt, I see you smiling up there in the top right. Are you dealing with some of those similar frameworks that Gillian's talking about?
Yeah, I smile because she made reference to our regulator and the lovely new standard that we have, which is CPS 234. So most of the financial institutions in Australia will be complying with that or required to comply with it, and then has a significant piece around third-party assessment. So at IAG, we look at the vendor holistically across all of the operational risk classes. So we have cyber risk, which is one, but we also have fraud, corruption, employment practices, and workplace safety. So it starts off with, through the procurement process, we look at how we would segment our suppliers, what their risk posture is, and then that really drives the level of assessment that we will do in each of the risk classes.
Love it. I appreciate that, man. And I hear you talking about some of the processes you have. Would you mind just kind of continuing and talking about what your process is for assessing and onboarding new vendors?
Yeah, sure. So we will ask a series of high level questions about the nature of the third party, the relationship, whether or not they're processing our information or using it in some way. Are they located on or offshore? What is the volume of information? And depending on the answers of the characteristics of that third party, we'll give them a rating. We call it an assurance rating, and then from that it'll drive the form frequency of assessment that we do.
Love that. Sounds like a really nice process. And how have our questionnaires or UpGuard questionnaires helped you at all with that type of process?
Yeah, because it's one of the types of assessments that we will do. So we might do an on-site assessment where we're actually doing a realistic audit and seeking evidence of controls and evaluating both the design and operating effectiveness of controls. But where we need to get coverage across a large number of suppliers, that's not feasible. So as we work through our risk posture, we start to introduce self-service questionnaires, and that's where UpGuard has really helped us.
That makes sense. Yeah, love to hear that. And Gillian, kind of same question for you. What is your process right now for assessing and onboarding new vendors, and how has UpGuard questionnaires helped you out with that?
Well, very similar indeed to Matthew's description there, except we have our ratings in tiers. So we have a risk tier. After we put our vendors through the triage process, assessing that generalized risk profile, they will come out of that with a tier ranking. And we use the tier rankings to determine which questionnaire we actually want to send to the vendor. So we'll have an UpGuard questionnaire for each of our 4 tier rankings. And we'll also use the tier rankings to guide whether we actually need face-to-face meetings as well, or whether the questionnaires and the email communications are sufficient.
I love that as well. Nick, how about yourself? Same question. Your process for assessing and onboarding new vendors, and how the UpGuard questionnaires have helped you out with that.
Sure, we do a similar sort of triaging process to get the real high-level view of everything. And like the other speakers mentioned, that helps us determine how we need to approach them, how thorough the whole process really is. And as far as the questionnaires go, they really help reduce the amount of back and forth that's required. They just gather us, so much information on the front end. Often we only need a handful of discussions with the vendor to really get through the whole thing. So definitely a big help.
Yeah, well, and it's great to hear what the process looks like right now, with UpGuard, some of the things you've taken, from your own organizations. But having heard that, would love to hear, what your process may have looked like before you began using UpGuard. Nick, would you mind sharing what that looked like for you before you started using some of our questionnaires and whatnot?
Sure. Well, it was spreadsheets and emails, more or less. We did have a platform to sort of log it all in, but it really boiled down to those documents. We did have sort of our own questionnaire, yes, no, tick the box, but UpGuard really allows, it uses that conditional logic feature to intelligently ask questions and allows them to skip over unnecessary ones. And then it provides them a form field to really expand upon some of those answers, which is honestly pretty crucial. Yeah.
Have you found that with that form field, they're able to give you a lot more information than previously, to help kind of delineate what's happening with their posture?
Yeah, absolutely. The additional context is huge. It just lets us get a bigger picture. The audit perspective, as we call it, just the yes, no answers, really makes it difficult to really get a good picture from the get-go. And it might eliminate the usefulness of that questionnaire if you really just have to have that discussion anyways.
Right.
Being able to give them the opportunity to give you that extra color makes it more worth your time and effort.
Yeah. So on the front end, you can kind of give them that opportunity to save you some work on the back and having to chase them down and get those things answered.
Yes, sir.
That's always good, right?
Mm-hmm.
Gillian, same question for you. What did your process look like before you began using UpGuard for some of these things?
Once again, spreadsheets and emails. And I think the biggest benefits which we've found have been the streamlining of the process and the ability, as Nick mentioned, to drill down, obtain brief summaries on the most important and salient questions almost automatically, so that we can then process those questions in a streamlined manner as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. No, I hear that a lot. Spreadsheets and a lot of heavy lifting. Matt, was that the same for you? Your kind of process before you were able to use UpGuard?
Yeah, look, it's a common theme I think across
Yeah.
everyone. Is that's how it was done. It's a historical approach, and I guess the two main additions that I'd add to what the others have said is the open source intelligence around the vendor rating really helps provide some color to the questionnaire as well, which you don't get without being able to do that in the system. And it's not directly attributable to maybe the service that they're providing us, but it's definitely indicative of their culture, the security culture, and what they need to improve on. So I think that's the other part that the vendor risk process has helped us with in UpGuard. And the other piece that we've been able to do is we're a fairly large ServiceNow shop as well for remediation management and tracking in our GRC activities. And so through UpGuard's API, we've been able to extract all of that information and actually actively manage it. So I think it's been really helpful in the way that you guys have done integration as well as the functionality itself.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. And I feel like one of the common threads I'm hearing from all of y'all is that, it's been a big time saver. When you're thinking about off the top of your head, if you're able to estimate, how much time would you say that using some of the questionnaires in the platform has saved you? I mean, Matt, would you mind just sharing that? I know you were kind of just talking about some of the benefits that you've seen there.
Yeah, look, I think from a timeliness perspective, it's definitely saved a lot of interaction going back and forwards with the third party because of the dynamic nature of the forms. That's hard to achieve in a spreadsheet without some crazy VB to actually write into the spreadsheet or macros. So I think that's one piece. The other piece, which is probably more important for me, is not so much the time, but the integrity of the data. Any spreadsheets or emails are always flawed with errors, and things can go wrong. And so capturing it in the system is and having the integrity controls over the data is probably what is more important from my perspective.
Yeah, that makes sense. No, I really appreciate that. Gillian, same question. Do you have an idea, maybe time savings or some of the other benefits you've seen similar to Matt?
Yeah. Difficult to quantify the precise time saving, but there's no question, it is a huge time benefit, time saver to be using it. Those to and fro's, the questions leading to questions from the questionnaire, all of that. I think the biggest element of the questionnaire for me in time saving has been the ability for our third parties to delegate other entities to answer their areas of the questionnaire via their interface, so they can just go flick, flick, flick and gather in answers from all HR, IT, whatever different groups, and do that rather than us having to go back and forth with them. So massive time savings.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point right there. Nick, same question. Time savings or some other benefits you've seen, maybe similar to Matt and Gillian so far with the questionnaires?
Sure. As the others said, it's difficult to measure, but it definitely varies per vendor on what sort of approach we take. But I would say it easily measures in hours, for each individual vendor. So it's a big help.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Gillian, so I really liked hearing your point about the ability to engage with vendors and whatnot in the platform. So I'll pose this question to you first. How have you been able to engage with maybe some reluctant vendors or vendors you're trying to chase up to finish their questionnaire? Kind of walk us through some of your strategies on that. I'm sure everybody would love to hear that, as that is the question I personally get all the time, so I know others have it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I guess two aspects to it. One is I was surprised by the lack of pushback and actually the enthusiasm with which vendors welcomed this, because I always make the point, this is like a free security check for them as well. And much as we might not thoroughly enjoy all of the regulatory controls that we need to bring in, they're actually there for a very good reason. And businesses are so interconnected now that we are as strong as our weakest link, all of us. And often a third party can be that weak link. So across the board, I've actually had really positive responses from third parties. I mean, oh, this is great. I didn't know I had that obsolete domain sitting there. Thanks for that. We'll get that cleaned up. So especially the scan has got some great feedback. On the negative side, well, the only really negative experience that I've had has been vendors being a little bit nervous. What are you scanning? Are you doing a penetration test? We haven't given you permission for this. So we are able to assure them this is all in the public domain. And to bring it right back home, occasionally I will say, this is in the public domain. This is what the malware agents are doing too. So if we can find it and we're telling you about it, we're giving you a huge advantage. Everybody can access this. So that's two aspects, generally the pushback. And really the answer to that is that's the world that we live in. We all need to be prepared for it.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? Using it as like a win-win for everybody, right? You're getting the information you need, but then the vendor may also learn some things about their posture that they just didn't know. And that's to Nick. I see you smiling on my left side. So same question to you. How have you maybe engaged with some reluctant vendors or those who've had some pushback on wanting to answer questionnaires?
Sure. I honestly just a very similar experience to Gillian. It was like listening to myself even. I mean, we've used those same lines. It's a free security assessment, and honestly, we don't have a lot of pushback. So most of them appreciate it. Most of them like it. Most of them found things that they didn't know they had, and they said, "Oh, yeah, we're aware of this, and we're happy to take care of it and address it." And it just kind of, I mean, it helps their security folks too. It gives them that need to help push others to get the remediation and the funding they need to take care of some of these issues, because they say, hey, our clients are looking at this, we should look at this. So for the most part, it is a very positive. There's only been one case where we had any sort of pushback, and it was exactly the same situation. We just explained this is all public information, this is what everyone is looking at, and it's ultimately a win-win for both of us. So just really talking them through the platform and what it does, and specifically how it works. And again, that's another thing I heard was penetration testing, don't do this, but just explaining to them how it works goes a long way. And after that conversation, they're willing to work with you.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And Matt, have you dealt with some similar type of issues, or kind of that Nick and Gillian have dealt with potentially reluctant vendors or vendors who really liked getting the questionnaire?
Yeah, look, I think for us they vary a little bit, most are positive about the outcome. I think the challenging part, and it's more of an industry question, it's not necessarily an issue with the questionnaire, is just the volume of questionnaires that third parties get. So if you just think about the three of us using a single third party, we're sending them 3 questionnaires to complete, then multiply that by how many customers they have, and they've got to complete all of those questionnaires. So I think it's a scale issue that vendors are more concerned about, as opposed to the individual questionnaire itself. So I think there's opportunity for us to think about some sort of a marketplace concept as we move forward, where we can share information about third parties and their responses. But on the flip side, for us, some of the levers that we have, we spoke earlier that our regulator has introduced a new standard around this, and so we have some regulatory obligations, and we've included those in our contractual clauses with suppliers. So if you want to do business with us, these are things that you have to do, and therefore it's now a requirement of them to actually get those things done. But that being said, there is a growing problem in the industry where suppliers are being asked to do many of these questionnaires, and I think it's incumbent on us to come up with a better solution for how we can solve that problem.
That totally makes sense. And Matt, I'm glad you brought up the scalability point, because a question I had for you, and I've had some customers talk about this maybe helping them with that, is how do you plan on maybe using some of the custom questionnaires to, set up questionnaires that may be shorter, longer, whatever kind of suits your needs to send out to your vendors you're working with?
Yeah, definitely. We grappled with that over time, because we used a single questionnaire for most vendors, and then we used the short and long form questionnaires as the two binary questionnaires that we would use and send out based on the size of the vendor. And we really feel now we're at a stage where we actually need to be a bit more granular with the types of questions that we want to provide them. So I mentioned earlier that we go through and do a risk or an assessment over the vendor and give them a rating. We want to get down really granular to our really lower risk suppliers where we know we have to touch, because there have been instances out there where even an insignificant third party has been compromised. So we still know we have to do some due diligence, but the level of due diligence is not going to be as high. So the custom questionnaires are really giving us that opportunity to tailor our controls to meet the vendor's risk profile.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And one thing too, I wanted to pause as we get closer towards the end of our session, just to be able to remind all of the attendees that if they do have any questions that you would like me to ask the panelists, please just include those in the chat, and we can pull those out and ask the panelists, ask our team here. But also too, it's been really great to hear kind of how the questionnaires and whatnot may have positively affected your vendors, where they're uncovering things that they didn't know. I would love to hear from y'all maybe how using the questionnaires have maybe positively impacted other parts of your own business, right, your own organization. So Nick, I'll start with you. Maybe have using the questionnaires positively impacted anything else with your business or team over at UofL?
Sure. Yeah. Oftentimes I'll review them with our security engineering team, because honestly, they have a higher level of knowledge than I do. So it really just helps us collaborate and kind of share that knowledge as well. Not just myself, but among other stakeholders that have to be involved in these things. And then you'll get to someone like the business owner or a sponsor who never has to deal with this stuff day to day whatsoever. They're not involved in the IT world at all. And if you might have a negative assessment where you have to explain why there's an issue, at least you don't have to go all the way in the details, but they can at least understand what some of the risks they face are, and why we have to worry about these things, and how important it is to be so careful and conduct your due diligence.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And Gillian, same question for you. Have you seen that your security questionnaires positively impacted other parts of Hannover, right?
Yes, very much the same responses Nick mentioned. In addition, I think the explanatory notes that UpGuard includes on what is this, why is it a problem, are incredibly helpful, because otherwise you're doing that training again and again for pretty much everybody that you talk through that questionnaire with, which might involve business experts who are not malware experts at all. So that's extremely helpful. And also just the format of the questionnaire is streamlining, as Nick said. Again, you can sit down with that and look at the questions and the responses and go straight to the areas you need to examine with anyone of any degree of knowledge. So very useful in that way.
Perfect. That's great to hear. And Matt, same question for you. Have you seen the questionnaires affect other parts of the business over at IAG?
Yeah, definitely. I think we're able to provide visibility to the accountable business owner for a particular third parties, and being able to provide the results in the way that described in the questionnaire just helps them make some decisions about whether to actually put in some additional mitigating controls with their third party, or whether to accept a given risk that the third party is not going to actually treat. So it just gives them the information to be able to make a better risk-informed decision.
Perfect. That's great to hear. And sticking with you, Matt, how are you using these questionnaires alongside typically the vendor security ratings?
Yeah, so we've, as I was mentioning before, we traditionally do the questionnaires. The vendor security ratings are really used as an indicative rating over the security posture of the third party. A lot of the times when we're using the ratings, because it will identify a number of domains across the third party owns, it may not necessarily relate to a specific service that they're providing you. However, what it does do, it gives you a good indication of the security culture in the organization. If they've got a number of configuration or misconfigurations in their vendor score, or vulnerabilities that are appearing. However, in their questionnaire, they're answering to the affirmative. You start to question their responses a little bit more about, well, are you really doing those things that you said in your questionnaire when you're getting such a poor rating in your vendor score?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. That's a great feedback right there. And I have one last question to ask in a round robin format for the team. But again, if any attendees have any questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A, and I'll ask the panelists here. But the one I wanted to ask to come as we wrap up is, Nick, I'll start with you. Have you uncovered any surprising information from vendors using our questionnaires? And if so, if you can share, what have you found?
Sure. Yeah, there was one instance we found some responses that didn't quite make sense. So, we had to have a conversation with the vendor and kind of get them to elaborate on what they meant. And honestly, we found they didn't quite know what they were talking about. So that really set the tone of the rest of the assessment. And we were pretty shocked because this vendor that I'm thinking of, I'm not going to name them, but they were a widely used global vendor. I think they're one of the leaders on the Gartner Magic Quadrants, and we were pretty shocked to see that lack of understanding. So it was very eye-opening, and we ended up not using that vendor. But kind of like Matt said, you might find that they say one thing on the questionnaire, but then the web scan or some of the documentation they provide shows another thing. And we've found that a few times, and sometimes it's an honest misunderstanding or a mistake, but sometimes they need to clarify that. They might need to check internally, and they say, wait a minute, how do we have this configured? So that's another thing that comes to mind.
Yeah, so it's nice to be able to kind of meld those two, right? What they're saying versus what the scanner's picking up, and kind of get everything tied in a bow.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. Gillian, same question. Have you found anything surprising that you can share with these security questionnaires?
Well, this turned out to be quite a trend, really. So it's not so much surprising anymore, but it was very interesting. We found a real theme. Many of our vendors, I think due to the nature of IT and the nature of business, are a small company swallowing up other companies, being swallowed up by large companies. Rapid change, and managing change is really hard. So when we first started having these conversations, we'd constantly be finding domains that had been forgotten, sites that had been forgotten, that had security vulnerabilities in them that could definitely be used. And that's probably more surprising now to the vendors than it is to us, because we almost expect that. There's so much activity and change. It gets pushed off the high priority list to lock down that domain or tidy it up, and then it gets forgotten. So that's been very interesting. And vendors are usually really grateful to have that brought to their attention.
That's awesome. It's lovely to hear that the vendors get grateful to hear, the information that you're bringing to their attention as well. Same for you. Have you found anything surprising you can share with using these questionnaires?
Yeah, look, I think it's probably more in the vendor rating side of things, where you're sharing their digital footprint. Not a lot of third parties really understand, or not a lot of organizations potentially really understand what their digital footprint actually looks like. And so being able to share that with them and show them, what domains they got registered and what their scores are across all the domains is insightful and enlightening to them sometimes.
Yeah, that makes sense. Oh, and it's definitely interesting to be able to, like you said, find those things out, uncover those, work with the vendor to fix them, and just see what that relationship's going to look like. Is it going to be great? They're going to be happy, or a little bit less excited to have found what you found to be uncovered.
Yeah.
Well, perfect. Well, as we wrap up our time today, I just wanted to close with a couple of things. First, I just want to remind all of our attendees that we do have a feedback form pinned to the top of the chat panel. So if you're able to, please just take a couple minutes on that and share your feedback. We really appreciate that as we're trying to continue to make these summits valuable for all. Really, I just want to thank, first off, our panelists, Nick, Gillian, and Matthew, for joining us today. I found this conversation very insightful, and hope you all in the audience did as well. I'll pause real quick. We do have one question in the Q&A that I'll ask. I'll pose this to the group. This is from Andrew. Thanks, Andrew, for the question. Nick, I'll start this with you. His question is, how do we synchronize if we change the questionnaire old versus new? And I'm trying to think, Andrew, if you mean how so if you have a couple revisions in the questionnaire. I think this may be trying to to talk about either A, how we're changing the custom questionnaire, or B, how you may be corresponding with your vendors with the correspondence window if they maybe need to revise something. And Andrew, please type in the chat again if that's not what you're looking to ask, but that's kind of what I'm gathering now. So I guess, Nick, I'll start with you. Are you able to, or have you had any times where you're working with vendors and using that correspondence window to kind of guide them through filling out revisions or filling out new answers that need to be highlighted for you?
As far as revisions to the questionnaire, say where we need to go back and ask them to make updates, we have used that before.
Okay.
And it is good to be able to track those differences to see what's changed. Because I believe we've only used it a handful of times, but I believe there is sort of a version history in there where you can see the different responses in the past. So we have used that a handful of times, and it is nice to be able to see what changed and be able to dig into that further.
That makes sense. Gillian, same thing. Have you been using that at all to help with that?
Well, I guess in a slightly different angle on the question, if it's around which a change of request or a change of which questionnaire is suitable, we have encountered that from time to time. We have a lot of highly technical third parties, but we also have simple medical practices and rehab providers, so a very wide range of type of third party. And occasionally we will cancel one questionnaire and reissue a different one after a conversation with the third party and us looking again at their triage and their risk tier. And as Nick mentioned, I think we do have an audit trail on that, so we can actually switch the entire questionnaire if we need to.
Yep. And Matt, same question for you, and even too, if you're able to speak on anything that you've done with the questionnaire builder, as far as, if you're editing the questionnaires you're working on and resending to a certain vendor at all.
Yeah, I think we've used it predominantly to issue a new questionnaire. So if we would change our questions or the structure, we'll create the new questionnaire and then send it out, have a conversation with the third party and make sure they understand what the changes to the controls are or the questions that we're asking are and why they're there, and then let them complete a new questionnaire.
Perfect. That makes sense. And I appreciate y'all, answering that question. I think that's all we have right now on the Q&A side. So again, Nick, Gillian, Matt, we all really appreciate you guys joining us for this panel. I found, again, the answers very insightful. I hope that the rest of those who attended did as well. Again, we do have that feedback posted on the Q&A, and then we're also going to be sending out an email after that will have that survey. And again, thank you so much for attending, everybody today, our panelists, our guests. We hope to see you guys soon and at the next summit.
It's a pleasure. You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.